rounded off with some PhD work, really looking at two organisations. You'll be happy to know I'm not going to take you through the academic version of this, which I did present just recently. So if you just have a quick look, I'm probably writing up now, so most of this fieldwork has already happened. I mean, I'm getting back to some of the academic literature and actually just looking at how that compares with what's already been done and how this adds to that. The two cases we tried different things in, so they were quite immersive cases where we actually got very involved, almost as a consultant, working in the background with these projects. A, to understand the project, but B, to try and test some different approaches in terms of how we might actually look at them, what data they might want to collect and we might want to collect on the back of that. I'll give you some findings, just an emerging framework that's coming out of that, which we think might be quite useful to look at how we actually think about these projects. And what we need to pay attention to in order to actually get some of the outcomes we might want. It's quite a human-centric view, and we'll go through that again. So part of the starting point for this PhD was the fact that a lot of the discussions and a lot of the research that I came across was very much about data warehouses, tool sets, what you have to track with what kind of data, and you'll formulate, you get an answer out of that, which you then magically or immediately get some value from. And this is basically trying to take a slightly more complex view of that. So actually, it starts with the human having to make sense about some sort of problem that they're trying to solve, how data might help, and so on. So we'll have a look at some thinking and theory that might therefore be useful. And also some practical implications. Why is this different to perhaps the way that we might approach projects at the moment in data? This is just a very quick sort of academic sort of slide. So if you do want the academics, there is a paper on the back of this, which I will share with you afterwards and so on. But it's basically ethnographic work in two sort of projects. One of them was a district council that was actually using data as its starting point. And I'll introduce that in a little bit more detail. The other one was a rail project where again they were trying to use data to try and improve maintenance. So they're quite different projects, and I think what we were trying to look at there was in what ways do they come across similar challenges, and how might a learning approach or way of thinking about them actually help think about how you might solve some of those problems. The kinds of data we collected were very much these news observations and looking at the whole of the project documentation. In the one case, we actually did a kind of insight question workshop, so we actually looked at what kind of insights were they really after, what data did they have available. So that was one approach. On the other one, we actually introduced this idea of communities of practice, and we tried to actually map the different practitioner groups that were involved in this particular initiative, and that threw up some different insights. Okay, and then we then have a quick look from a theory perspective. It doesn't seem to have printed particularly well on the screen, but there are quite a few discipline areas that are interested in data if you take a broad enough view. So if you look at data just in terms of what we would traditionally call information systems or computer science, that's very much a algorithmic view of what we do. So in other words, you've got some data, you've got to process it in some way, and you get an answer out of it. And a lot of the research focuses therefore on how you integrate this data, how you store this data, how you process this data, and the algorithms and tools and so on that you might use. But if you then took a step back and said, well, actually what we're trying to do is generate new insights, there are quite a few disciplines that are interested in generating insights, and you could look at that from a learning perspective, you could look at that from a research perspective, you could even look at it from a cognition perspective. Sense-making perspective is another one where, what meaning do you attach to certain things? And then knowledge management also tends to play in that domain. But knowledge management tends to be much more about knowledge transfer, but it can be about new knowledge discovery as well. So these are all different ways of thinking about how you might create new knowledge or new insight. They focus at very different levels, so research and development very much at an industry sector level or a field level, or potentially at an organisational level if you've got an R&D unit. Learning can vary quite a bit in terms of, is it group learning, is it individual learning, is it based on using textbook learning, or is it social learning? So there are lots of different learning theories out there. I didn't realise quite how contested the field it was. Knowledge management, on the other hand, has been very much ground in two kind of ways of looking at the world. One was very much codify something and put it into a portal and make it available, and people would really just go there and grab what they needed and learn from that. But it was a much more social approach, which said, these things have to be contextualized. You've got communities of practice that share practice and war stories, and that's how they actually learn quite a lot. And occasionally they might refer to some codified practice. So to what extent do you codify your practice depends very much on the practitioner grouping, their preferences, how much of that is standardizable, if you like. Okay, and then on the cognition side, again, that's very much at a psychology level almost, or sort of physically, how do we perceive our sensory inputs and so on. So that's fairly individualistic focused. What we then eventually settled on was this idea of looking at situating individuals within a project team. And there is a bit of learning literature which specifically looks at this kind of idea of situated learning. How do practitioners potentially do that? And that overlaps quite a lot with this communities of practice thinking within knowledge management. So there seems to be quite a lot of overlap there. And it also shares quite a few assumptions with this idea of sense making, what kind of meaning is attached to what we're doing and the data that we're using and so on. Okay, so that's just a bit of theoretical background. If we now start just looking at the cases and getting a little bit more grounded in reality again. The first case was I had to attribute sort of non-plumes. So the one I've called PoshGov. So in other words, this is a district council, quite a posh one, and they've obviously had huge cuts in their government sort of funding, and have decided in a way to try and supplement their income by trying to come up with premium services rather than the bulk standards to a service that you don't get charged for as a resident. But what they wanted to do was really target those two particular potential customer groups. And because they were a wealthier borough and so on, they wanted to actually try and use Acorn household data, which is available and they had a subscription for, to try and isolate where these different groups were and what their particular preferences were in terms of what services might they be attracted to. And then actually try and come up with some new services or reshaped services which they could then actually launch. So there was this idea of what kind of market insights or customer insights could we draw on in order to inform this kind of new product development type of approach, or to test some of these product ideas. In the second case, it's completely contrasted. So you've got the public sector on the one side, on this side it's really a very large infrastructure project, where they were trying to, in essence, the bit that we were interested in was influence or improve maintenance practice. And what they wanted to do through this project was effectively gather together almost what we would call a virtual version of the infrastructure. Part of this was being prompted by the government initiative around what they call BIM, or Building Information Management, this idea that as well as just delivering the physical artifact, you're going to deliver all the information about that artifact in a way that means that you can then better maintain that infrastructure, and you'll be able to make more intelligent decisions about when to do certain maintenance, what maintenance is particularly useful, and so on. In a rail environment, obviously that's a very, very complex undertaking with lots and lots of data. There were quite a few players involved as well. So if you look here, you had, on the one hand, an overall project putting it all together that was going to produce the infrastructure. They were also collecting a whole lot of data from a design which they then farmed out to the construction subcontractors to actually go and build the infrastructure. Obviously that was the plan. What's actually built doesn't always mirror what's originally designed. So you have all these ideas of on-the-fly changes in response to things that work or don't work, or changes. So there was a sense that then they needed to get this as-built view of the world back into the kind of information set that they had. And then decide on the other hand, well, what needed to be handed over to the operators or the maintainers of this infrastructure that would be useful. Now obviously what the contractors needed was very much more, tell me what I need to know in order to build this thing. What the operators needed actually becomes quite interesting. We thought that should be obvious, it's just maintenance and it's what data do you need to actually maintain it. When you start digging into that, there are different answers there. So we spoke to some people and actually it was about making sure that what was delivered was safe. So had it been tested, had it, do we have audit trails around all the checks and balances that have been performed, so that we can actually say, yes, it is ready to go, it won't fall over, it's not going to cause a problem. Whereas even on the maintenance side, which was the ostensible sort of step, you could unpack that. There were maintenance teams that would need to have certain information, and having certain information when they went out to go and do their maintenance jobs and so on would be really useful. They wouldn't actually have to carry around physical data in sort of printouts and things like that. But at a different level, the maintenance scheduling and the planners of the maintenance were actually the ones that were probably going to potentially get more value out of this data, because they could actually decide at a much higher level strategically what was going to be worth paying attention to and maintaining more often. So when we then had a quick look at, this is the slightly innovative way that we went about doing the district council sort of workshops. They were going through what we call a business model exercise. Obviously we were interested from an ACOM data perspective pretty much in what we call the customer-centric half of that business model, not the whole business model. And what we did in the workshops was really just go and ask them, well, what kind of questions are you trying to answer about your customers or about the product set that you're trying to test, and and put them into one of these kind of categories. Is it about pricing came up quite a lot. What can we charge for this? What would the market bear? What would people be prepared to pay? On the other hand, it was a question of, well, how best to get this to the market? What would be the right channel? How could you actually present this in the best way? Which would be the right channel to market through and so on. And then also, what kind of market segments, what kind of customer segments would be interested in this and which ones wouldn't be, or how would we have to position for some of those. And then also, is the actual proposition that we've got in place really something sensible can define it? And needless to say, one of the key findings was we got lots and lots and lots and lots of questions. Now, what we were trying to look at was, how do those questions change as they become more mature in trying to do this kind of work and so on. And to be honest, that we didn't see that maturation process because they were still just very early on in their maturity of doing this. But what it did mean is we then tried to plot those in terms of how many of these questions were quite clearly defined. In other words, were they very woolly, very indistinct, or were they really, really clearly defined? And also to what extent did they either have the data already, or would they need to go and get that data? So just in terms of trying to prioritise, would this be easy to do, would this be difficult to do, how much investment would be required? We kind of did this kind of 2x2 exercise. And it was interesting that the low-hanging fruit are very much the kind of very clear questions where we have the data, no problem at all. And there were a couple of those. The biggest category by far were things that we'd like to know, very reasonably clear about them, but we don't have the data. And then there's a real investment decision there about, well, what do we prioritise there? What's really, really important to know in order to then launch this product? Or could we go ahead and do a soft launch to test some of these and actually do some data collection on the side? So one of the key things that came out of this was, well, how much data, how much market insight is enough for us to make a decision about whether we launch a product or not? And again, it comes down to one of those risk calls about, well, actually, if you're happy to have quite a high risk appetite, you might get quite a few of these answers not being there. Some of them might be more important than others, if it's about financials behind it, whether it requires a lot of investment or not. So those are some of the discussions that pop out of this. There were a number where the questions were just not clear. So then we need to go back and actually do quite a lot of thinking before we actually came back with clearer questions. Okay, so that was the one exercise which was quite a useful one for them. The second case, we did something different. It was a much larger project with lots of different moving parts and lots of different groups involved. And it was with that context in mind that we thought, well, actually, let's look at this from the communities of practice perspective. How many different groups were there? Were there from different communities of practice? And we kind of mapped these different groups out there. And some of them were actually within the kind of overall project group. Some of them were actually down to the coal-face building stuff. You had, those within the kind of core central project, but then you had a lot of subcontractors. So what you can see here is just a very quick extract as an illustration of some of the boundaries that creep in here. And some of them are organisational or contractual. So in other words, you've got contractors who have kind of a very formal interaction with the overall project, you know, through the contract, through formal project review meetings and things like that. But they're actually co-located. So you've kind of got some of these tensions here between, they're all engineers or they're all document controllers, was another group that was very important here. In other words, they were just the admin people who actually kept track of all these documents that actually captured all this data. And then they interacted again with this group that sat, you know, at effectively like a head office or at the contractor's sort of main office. And in fact, there was often more distance between these groups here together and the main office than there was between these two groups on the ground. So in other words, there was this idea of remoteness really in terms of the overall kind of project sitting in the background, demanding information or demanding things to be done. Okay, so quite a few of these things. Now what also came through is these ideas of boundary spanners, people who span these different boundaries, be it between this project level and the central team. And you did find these people who actually sort of were the communication links. Some of them were formal through review meetings or forums that they used to hold. Others were just purely relationship based, or because of their role they had to go out there quite a few times. But they often came from particular discipline angles. So for instance, if you looked at the main project was organised very much around people who were interested in the engineering design. You had those that were interested in the construction delivery. You had those that were interested in maybe the quality assurance around some of those sort of things, be it the data or the construction. And they all came in with different slices when they came to visit this particular project. But they were all kind of boundary spanners in their own way. The biggest divide was probably with the operators who would eventually take this data that was going to be collected and then use it. Because from their perspective, it was something that was going to land in about 2 or 3 years' time. Getting them engaged to try and define requirements now for something that they didn't quite really have to get to grips with for another 2 or 3 years was difficult. It was an abstract exercise, if you like. And that becomes quite key in terms of trying to get them to actually ground out what it is that they need right now. Okay. If we then actually get into some of the findings that came out, I mean, on one case we mentioned already, you know, this idea of how much can scientists have. And this is one of the challenges from one of the senior deputy CEOs actually at the County Council. In other words, there was this recognition that we could spend a lot of time collecting data, a lot of time doing analysis, would have changed the answer. And having to do this kind of risk sort of framework for them to actually say, well, actually some important questions you need to cover off before you get. And it was very much this investment idea through. But that often seems to be both a hurdle for data guys to actually say, well, actually, they were keen to go into a lot of data collection and so on, but actually, was there support for that kind of exercise? As it happened, in fact, they had a near miss with one of the products because they hadn't tested some ideas. So again, this becomes often the kind of war story that says, well, you have to do some. So the question is really how much is enough and what kind of analysis. The idea of prioritizing where to focus came through quite a lot, especially in terms of questions. In other words, if you're going to be questioned, they recognise that there could be loads of questions. Challenging yourselves as to which of those is the most important to answer is not straightforward. And then often you run into this idea of lack of better data being available. So even though you might have lots of data, you might not have exactly what you need to answer the question. And then it becomes the investment decision. Do we collect that data? Is there data available that you could try and collect or not? What we did find was even though there was this kind of world of acorn household data, on its own it didn't actually answer the question. So what came through very clearly was that they had this theory that they were working with, which was if we look at the data, it will tell us who to go and sell to. That was the kind of underlying hypothesis. But that wasn't actually made very clear, and it wasn't tested very early. So it's only when they started doing this that they kind of realised, it's not quite as clear cut as that. You know? So in other words, what they then tried to do is triangulate that with other things like having short focus groups. And part of the reason that it didn't really is that it focused very much on household data. And this is something that comes up in quite a lot of cases. If you collect data for one purpose, it doesn't readily translate into another use it may have shortcomings for that use because that wasn't the purpose for which it was collected. And that could be reflected in the fact that the data quality might not be that great for that other purpose, or just the measurement unit might not be quite what you need. So here is focused at the household level. They may be interested at the individual level, and that this wouldn't tell you. Now, if they had better information internally, that they could then actually look at who do we currently service around certain things, and triangulate that with some of the stuff that they have in the household data, that could have done quite a lot more, but they ran into those kind of hurdles because they didn't have that readily available. So there were lots of these sort of challenges that popped out. The other thing is that they were dealing lots of times with averages for areas and so on, and they found that very difficult. So when we spoke to another district council that was using it, we found that they had run into very similar problems. They were a lot more mature in their use of data. So they already recognised this, they'd done some of the triangulation, but even they had decided that there were limits to what you could do, and their purpose was very different. So whereas these guys were trying to serve new markets or identify new markets and new products, the other district council that was much more mature was interested much more in service delivery, and they were trying to basically enable their interaction with a lot of the residents and therefore do a lot of cost cutting. So a completely different purpose. But what they wanted to make sure was that they could demonstrate from a political perspective that they hadn't marginalised any groups. So they had a very different purpose, and therefore they had a very different slice of this data and how they were going to use it. And they were very, happily, being a little bit more mature on the data side, able to triangulate that with service data and data about disadvantaged groups and superimpose those and so on. So you got the sense very definitely there was a lot of learning about how to handle data, and there was a lot more clarity about what this was going to do and what they could actually, how they could use this. I mean, to give you one idea, they came up with a composite index, and they recognized that different parts of that district council would have different uses for this data, and therefore certain elements of this index may be more applicable than others. So they said in total that took about 2 years to settle. So even from the outset where they decided that this was the objective, they wanted to get a better handle on how these different groups were actually dispersed within their sort of remit. It still took 2 years for them to actually come up with a common set of definitions across the different functions about what might work, and there's flexibility in terms of how you might define an index that could be flex for different uses. Okay, the other thing that was interesting was this idea of the data collection being divorced from the data use, if you like. And this came through particularly in the larger project. In other words, this idea that in the Acorn case, this is collected for the whole of the UK, and it's done for all sorts of different purposes. The guys who did data collection weren't at all involved in this idea of use. So there was just a real hurdle of getting to know the data and understand how it was collected and what assumptions were embedded in that. If you then looked at it from the infrastructure project perspective, again, the guys who were collecting all this documentation were actually embedded on the project. As far as they were concerned, this was contract documentation. They had to tick a box to say, I built this according to the spec. Here's the proof for that. And we've had it checked, and the safety checks check out, and all the rest of it. They didn't have any kind of maintenance mindset at all in collecting that data. The data was collected in document format. From a use perspective, from a maintenance perspective, that would somehow have to find its way into some sort of system which the maintenance crews used, or in a format that they would find useful. And they would probably only find a fraction of that data useful, and for different types of maintenance or different types of sort of infrastructure, again, different elements would be useful for different sets. For the audit trail guys, it would really just be some of the safety checks, for instance. So again, you get this idea that even though you're collecting one set of data, it could be for multiple purposes. And if you've got this two separate groups, they may not understand the importance of what it is that they collect, and data quality might suffer and so on. There's also this idea of intermediaries being important, I think, in the, we talked about this household focus for Acorn data. And what they discovered was actually that a lot of the services that they delivered were not direct to residents at all. They were actually provided through intermediaries. And it was much easier to go and ask the intermediaries than it might be to actually try and collect all of the data. So again, you get this idea of, is it easier to engage with the data, or is it easier to go and engage with the phenomenon that you're interested in? If I want to understand maintenance practice, do I really go and look at the whole documentation, or do I go and speak to a couple of maintenance engineers, or do I go and observe maintenance as it's happening? So there are these ideas of, is this a phenomenon that you can go and directly observe, or is this something that you can only really get a handle on through data? And we'll come back to that as being potentially quite important. And then there are lots of assumptions. We talked about this theory-led approach. On the Acorn data side, it was very much this idea that the data will tell us something. We think it will tell us who. But it's only when you actually go and try and do that you discover that it might give you a hint, but it doesn't actually answer quite the question that you have in mind. Okay, if we then have a look from the communities of practice exercises and so on, what we found was the project centricity of the thinking was a really interesting factor. People were much more concerned about producing project artifacts than they were about producing outcomes. And this is very similar, I think, to some of the benefits realization work that's been done more broadly. In other words, what is it that you're trying to achieve on this project? And if you get bounded in this kind of project thinking, it's all about producing requirements, getting those signed off, and then producing an artifact that complies with that. Whereas if you're actually concerned about maintenance practice, well, actually, we may not be able to define this very clearly. Let's go and test with some real data we've collected. Oh, actually, it might be useful to also find out about X or also track Y. So this idea of trying to shorten that cycle and try and get learning cycles going rather than specifically being bounded by a project process. Very difficult if you've got contractual arrangements and all of that, because the boundaries really get in the way. The incentives aren't there. It's a question of, it might be nice to do that, but this is what we're contracted to do. So that came up as being a really big hurdle. The other thing was different communities saw things in very different ways, and not all of them were involved. So, part of the rationale behind maintenance, for instance, or smarter maintenance, was to bring the total cost of ownership down for this infrastructure. Now, I don't know about you, remember I heard that, I thought, where's finance? And finance, particularly if the operators weren't really engaged. Now, potentially they would be quite a big anchor for getting some focus on some of these, because the maintenance guys, well, it doesn't really matter, is anyone going to make me do this? I'm quite happy with doing it the way I'm doing it at the moment. On the other hand, if you have finance saying, look, we need to actually reduce maintenance costs by X, how are you going to do that? And you always take a help, but just generally get them engaged. They would have a different take on it. We also found that there were interesting requirements around sustainability, but again, they're being held up in different functional responsibilities. So again, their slice through this data would be, well, actually, we need to know what the energy footprint of these things is, and can we reduce that? And part of it comes through at the design stage, and then part of it comes through in terms of, well, how can we actually help improve our total cost around, if we can reduce the energy usage, or anything like that within the maintenance or usage sort of frame, that might be quite important. But a lot of those weren't actually engaged in the project. The guys had kind of been set a task, and then it was mainly about data collection in order to produce this artifact, and then it would be handed over. Now that's a very different objective to improving maintenance, which you need the maintainers to be involved, and you need them to change their practices and so on. And again, we also looked at this idea of several boundary artifacts seem to be quite important. Now that's a bit of a communities of practice technical term. But this idea of how do you move between boundaries? You can get people that span these boundaries, but you can also get documents that are effectively handed over between things. And one of the things that came out is actually that data itself is actually a boundary artifact, or whatever they call it. So in other words, when you create data for somebody else, what they understand from that data isn't necessarily what you would have intended them to understand as the designer or creator. And that's one of these ideas is the fact that data can be viewed very much as facts, and that's quite a lot of the way in which it's talked about within the IT community. You've got some facts which you process and then you get insights. Whereas when you start unpacking this is very much more about people collecting data that they think is useful about something that they're interested in, and then collecting that in a way that other people might find it useful, but for different purposes. So they may take different meanings from it. If you're an accountant looking at all of this stuff, which is being collected by a marketing person, you will see very different things in the data. You'll probably think different things are important to get about a particular data. So I think what comes out of that is this idea that if you take as facts, you tend to get this idea that these things are static. So in other words, data is a snapshot, it remains constant and so on. But what does come out is just this idea that this data can change. And one way of looking at that is what you decide is relevant to collect in the first place will change. So as you get a richer idea of what's important for maintenance, you may decide that you actually need to collect some aspects about it. A practical example that I always think is quite nice is if you start looking at CRM systems and where they come from a historical perspective, the kinds of things that you used to collect about customers. So I suppose if you look back at 20 years ago, the kinds of things we used to collect about customers were typically their address, telephone number, whatever it might be. Now that has completely changed. If you look at CRM systems today, it'll be email addresses, it'll be all sorts of additional fields that just weren't there 20 years ago. And that's partly because they've interacted in a different way. But also we're now much more interested in the relationships. Now, if you look at the way that we architected those earlier systems, it was much more about being able to build people. So the purpose was about building people, what information do we need to know to build them, and collect the funds from them. Whereas now, it's much more about trying to work out, well, who do they influence, and how do they influence them, and how can we influence them, and interests in the networks that are around. And you would have a completely different data set that you would be looking at collecting that would help inform those decisions. You would optimize them as well. So one's kind of very much more a hard-coded database which is organized around a particular kind of customer number or whatever it might be, whereas this one would be much more interested in nodes in a network that were particularly good at influencing other people. So again, those are some of the things which again are shifting and would have different design underlyings, how you would optimize those and when to optimize those. Those decisions become very important. So what's emerged from all of this is really this idea of two interlocking logics that are at play in these projects. So some of the features is this idea, and I'll just use the infrared example to kind of unpack it a bit. There's this idea of being very interested in the phenomenon. It can be maintenance, it can be smarter construction as well, and that was in the background in this case as well. But the kind of things you would need to actually inform smarter maintenance would be potentially different from what you would need to know about how to be smarter about construction. And then, if you looked at the actual logistics involved in doing this, there were a whole lot of people collecting documents. You had an asset data team that actually organized these documents into some sort of hierarchy. Now, those decisions about how to organize these things are not straightforward, because again, you would organize for ease of use typically, or you organize for ease of processing or storage. And those are different optimizing schemas and so on. So a lot of these things were actually high-bound tools. So very early on, the tools had been selected, which meant that these hierarchies to some extent had already been predefined. You had to deal with what was available within that particular software and so on. And the same thing when you do that in an ERP type environment, you're actually buying the codification of the data as well as the actual structure and processing that goes along with that. So in a sense, the kind of tools that we decide to choose to use kind of steer you down what you can and can't do, what data you're likely to collect, how you might be able to analyze that, how you might be able to report that. And also, in terms of the people who are trying to make sense of that data would need to interact with that. Would they interact through some sort of interface in the tool? That becomes quite interesting, because if it's a generic tool that makes it very easy to deal with the data, you might expect to see more sort of exploration type activity going on. Whereas if it's very structured, and you get it in a particular kind of format, and it has to be a column of figures, then if you're an accountant, great for you, but if you're a marketing person, you may lose the water very quickly. So this is the kind of area where, if you're trying to get the guys to engage with the data in order to learn something from it, how do you present that back? Do they need to be tool specialists to be able to do that? Do they need to rely on a whole lot of asset or data specialists to be able to kind of deal with that? And these are some of the tensions that come into the project. Who are you relying on to actually draw the insight, and how how are you going to get it from these guys here? So if you did have data analysts, how would that influence the people who actually need to go and do a whole lot of maintenance? You know, how do you get that knowledge transfer going? And this idea of the people who engage with the data, the people who learn from the data, the people who engage with the phenomenon are ones who, you know, so there's this question of, if you're the practitioner, the choice is, well, I can go and find out what I need to know just by going out and going and having a look, or I have to go and look at some data. Now, if it's easy to look at data, then I might look at the data. But if it's easy to go and talk to some people or go and observe something, I might do that instead. So you can see how, you know, if it's easy to do one thing or easier to do one thing than the other, that may influence how readily these communities of practice might engage with data. Now, what's been very interesting, going back to the literature, looking at different domain areas that are very good at doing big data. You know, they're very specific disciplines that are way ahead of others when it comes to looking at data. So if you look at some of the biggest data projects are actually in the physics domain. So if you look at things like the Hadron Collider sitting over in Switzerland, it produces probably more data than any other big data project that I've come across. Now, the reason that they have to look at the data is the fact that they cannot study these things any other way than looking at the data, because it's just completely outside of our sensory sort of parameters, if you like. So really this phenomenon here is difficult to engage with directly. You're much more likely to end up engaging with the data, because that's the only thing that you can do. The other thing is, if you've got, I think, a fairly sophisticated research mindset and quite mature theories and ideas about this phenomenon, you can tighten that sort of definition of what it is that you're interested in, how the data is going to help you. You can test that much more clearly than if you've got a vague notion about, well, actually we're sort of interested in customer behavior, but, you know, what does that mean? How do you measure it? You know, you're into measurement issues, you're into, you know, what aspects of their behavior are you really interested in terms of trying to sell them the product? What's the situation that you know, trying to stop them leave your service? You know, those are things that kind of come. So this idea of the purpose being very important, how that, you know, what questions relate to the phenomenon, what are the fundamental questions that you're trying to answer, and then how does data actually relate to this phenomenon? How good a match is it? So if you look at research literature, there are lots of concepts around, is this data representative of the phenomenon that you're really interested in? How well does it measure it? These concepts of validity. Now, those don't come up very often in data speak, but I think they'd be very useful ones to actually look at testing. In other words, do we test how well this data fits what we're actually trying to answer? And then actually have a look at, or fine, if that doesn't, can we triangulate it with some other data? Do those have different assumptions starting points that we need to take into account and so on? So there's a whole cluster of stuff around that that might be useful, as well as trying to manage the fact that there are different communities involved, that speak different languages here. How do you get them to really sort of focus on the phenomenon of interest, not get lost in the data, or not ignore the data, or whatever it might be, depending on what they might do. Okay, so in terms of practical implications, the one thing that we did find was that kind of thinking of trying to map out, well, what is the purpose, what are the key questions, what is the phenomenon, what tools, what data, how do they relate, and who's involved in each of those areas, really starts unpacking a project in a way that we don't traditionally look at this. You know, it's all been about requirements definition, tool sets, you know, running a couple of things and then some answers. It also locates very clearly where the value is going to be crystallized. And it's not going to be from the inside. The value creation is going to be from those practitioners doing something different with the insights that they've learned. So if you leave them out of the picture, then potentially you don't get the benefit. So the question is, how do you bridge that? Do you get them more involved in being more data savvy and getting more involved with the data? Do you use visualization to make it more accessible? You know, those are some of the things that you could do, but that requires quite a bit of work. Or do you use people who are hybrids? And those are often the kind of boundary spanners that we identify, but often people who were somewhat good at data, and actually they had some practical experience in the area that they were trying to resolve. So typically this is the kind of business analyst type territory, and I think that would be very interesting to look at, you know, on a particular project like this, where are your boundary spanners? Which boundaries are you trying to span? and really support those initiatives and those people. Because what we did find is those tend to be part-time jobs, or they're not recognised as an important part of the project. And the projects are all focused on artefacts and outcomes, not on managing some of these developments. Okay, and then we talked a bit about the phenomenon access, this idea of, if it's easy to access the phenomenon, why is the data? There is something else which we didn't talk about. We did touch on that earlier, is if you're dealing with physical measurement of a physical phenomenon, that's very easy to measure in data terms. If you're dealing with social phenomena, much more challenging to measure and deal with. So when you're looking at these kinds of projects, trying to kind of characterize them in terms of how mature is this picture? Is the phenomenon clear? Are the techniques and data clear? Is the purpose clear? The less clarity you have, the more iterations you're likely to have to do, the longer the project is likely to take before you get progressively more clear about some of these things. So the same thing is if you're dealing with a social one, how mature is the theory that you're going to be using to do these predictions, to try and work out what data is relevant and so on? Because if that isn't the case, that's the first kind of iteration, is to try and get some clarity on some of those things before you can then really get too far in. It does align then very clearly with some of the more rapid application development type thinking of lots of cycles. Let's try and refine, let's get to use as quickly as possible. It won't be fit for purpose, but just to try and iterate as much as possible until you've got clarity. And I think this idea of trying to get to predictive analytics when you're not clear on the theory, you're not clear on the phenomenon, there's a path dependency there. If you look at the R&D literature, you wouldn't even know what's relevant unless you were actually part of the conversation. There's this very clear idea that you can only find out the next step based on what you already know. And I think that might be at play in some of these kind of learning models when you think about that. Okay, so what it does mean is if you start thinking about looking at your project in terms of use of practice and their maturity, and the maturity of the knowledge about this phenomenon, you can very quickly start doing risk analyses about, well, how risky is this project? How long is this likely to take? What checkpoints do we need to build into the project to try and actually make sure that this thing is going to do that? Okay, so those are some of the practical projects, sort of implications. Hopefully that will be useful. Okay, any thoughts or questions? I think that's pretty much the findings. Okay. Yeah, I think we covered those as well. Okay, there's one thing we haven't talked about here is just one thing that we did notice quite a lot is that there's been quite a big drumbeat about trying to get quantitative skills on board and data scientist skills on board. And actually what we're coming through here is just the idea of research skills being important. So it's a slightly broader set of skills than just statistics skills or facility with data. It's somehow this idea of having a research mindset. Okay. Any other questions then?
So, any questions for Martin? Really useful, sir. Particular thoughts?
So, were the two cases that you explored, did those parties get benefit from this? Are they valuable?
They did in different ways. So, for instance, and that was related to the kind of data interventions that we made. So, the one did find it really useful that we actually mapped out the questions that we were trying to answer and prioritise them for them. And actually, again, could link them very clearly to the business models and then have a conversation about which of these are more important and so on. So, from that perspective, it did flush out quite a lot of that very usefully for them. It did throw some other things up, which was actually, you can't do some of this data analysis type stuff if you don't even actually have a great deal of commercial sense and knowledge about how business models work. So actually what we threw up very quickly was that they actually needed to go into some business model training before they then went ahead and did some of this. On the infrastructure side, what they found particularly useful was thinking about these things in communities of practice terms, because that wasn't something that they thought of. So you had a whole of engineers that spoke one language, you had a whole of document controllers that spoke a different language, you had operators with a completely different mindset and time and lens focused on territory. So, and then you had project managers that were interested in a different kind of outcome. So getting that clarity and giving them a language to talk about, well, these different boundaries that need to be traversed. To be fair, they've probably got more of it in terms of the communication side of it and the issues that that threw up than they did this idea of trying to derive from data, because they just didn't have the responsibility for operators, so they couldn't influence operators to do the result that they needed to. It wasn't part of their contractual right. They had no leverage over those guys to actually bring them in and get them to start engaging. And to be honest, I think the only thing we did talk a bit about was to actually get some of the key players on the operator side to drive that, so maybe requiring us to do this stuff.
I suppose they can influence the contractual terms.
I think those were already set. I mean, what we did
Well, they are now, but in the future.
yes, so there's certainly going to be a lot of data, I think, for future projects. And I think there's a plan to go back and sort of, it was a quick iteration of things that you see a bit more. So there is a plan to go back there and actually say that there is some original insights that come out that we want to take forward for the next project. There was also some thinking just around the fact that even though you can't try and change the contractual terms, you could still reward good behaviour. And you could do that in non-financial terms. So you could just celebrate people who do the right things. And often people want to do the right thing. It's not just, and then also try to work through some of the practitioner groups. So what was very interesting was looking at the practitioner groups more broadly than just the project. Because engineers are typically part of an engineering fraternity. Document controllers who we're talking about, well, is there a document controller fraternity that you can kind of try and help influence some of these sort of the thinking. And I mean, there was some leeway in that direction, I think, on both fronts. Okay. Project managers, I'm not sure we really engage with them about the fact that some of their thinking actually gets in the way. That might be another conversation.
It sounds like from a big data and from any other analytical perspective, you've got to make sure the analysts are very closely linked to the people who really understand what's going on. So I think the world's best analyst, without access to that domain knowledge, you're going to really limit what you can do. So how do you get that across as a message to people who may be more focused on the tools than they are about the application of the tools?
That's a difficult one. I mean, one of the things that came through quite interestingly was just, I think organisations, and this depends where the organisation is at, if you've got a bit of a research mindset or a research function, I think it lends itself to this kind of inquiry in a way that if you're project focused, I think this project structure gets in the way. Because the moment you've got a project, you need a very tightly defined set of requirements, you have a budget, all the rest of it. When you start talking about learning iterations and the fact that this could take 2 or 3 years, and you're much more in the program territory than you are in the project territory, because there might be lots of mini projects that are easy to divide. I don't think you've got an aspiration over a 2 or 3 year period, not a clearly defined project. So I think the funding mechanisms for some of these things, if you go down the R&D route, could be much more as we want to do some R&D about better understanding customer behaviour. That's a much easier sell. In terms of funding, you may then have a couple of ideas, secret ideas, which you can go and test. If some of them fail, that's fine. You have a portfolio view of throwing some money into various projects and seeing which ones fail and which ones don't. So I think thinking about that kind of approach, an R&D type approach or a prototyping kind of venture capitalist type approach for a set of ideas around a particular area might be a much richer funding and structure for this kind of initiative, depending on how clear you are. If it's clearly defined, the problem definition is okay, the theory is okay, the tool sets are mature, you know how all that works, then it's much more about just making sure that the practitioners and the data scientists are working very closely together.
I think a lot of project managers in a research field do have this agile mindset of looking at the problem, defining an initial goal, developing a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis, modelling it, refining the goals. So, I mean, I think when you say project management, you're thinking traditional project management with a GATE system, clearly defined goals.
Absolutely, and this is why I'm saying, if you're going to go down project management route, typically these are managed, be it by IT projects.
Yeah.
you're in that kind of mindset, and I think what it requires is much more of the research project manager type mindset, and I think the research skills. And I think rather than going down the hard stats route in every case, that's going to be a problem. So if it's a social phenomenon that you're interested in, I think you need some social scientists to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I like your model. I would add to your model, obviously, the project management as a layer on top, and this emphasising the importance of the coming up with a goal, initial goal, a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, modelling it, and so on.
So I think the way you stage it, if you're going to go down that route, I think the way you stage it, and I think the research designs kind of thinking would be a much better one. Have you got a clear hypothesis? How are you going to test it? And I think trying to get clear these two different logics and how they play into each other. So the one is an inquiry logic, which fits very neatly with research. But research doesn't help you with the second part of the logic, which is how does that actually improve practice? And I think you need to actually look at both of those, and that's much more about actually getting engaged research. And I think we were just chatting beforehand, if you look at engaged researchers that are practitioner-led, like the medical field, where they've got a long tradition of both doing practice and doing research, and then informing their practice through their research, that's a very rich area for doing this kind of work. And different to other disciplines where they don't have that research and
I would argue, I mean, I work with a US-based software company that does web development, and they do iterations within under a minute. And they actually do live A/B testing. So, for instance, what they do is they actually talk to customers, and live they alter the code. So it's fully tested and checked. So, for instance, they've done a lot of hotel websites, and they've done them live in the hotel foyer, for instance. They've actually recoded the software, put it into A/B testing. So if you like, they come up with a hypothesis, check the hypothesis with an extreme UX style. It's then put live on an A/B testing. And then if it's more effective, then they swap over the platform. So it's, I would say that a lot of software development is moving into a research-based mode.
Yes, and getting to use as soon as possible, because it's through use that you kind of get this feedback loop going on. So I think the quicker you can get the users into use, I think, however rough and ready, and in fact there's a little bit of research that's emerging that actually the shinier and glossier and more finished the product looks, the less people want to play with it and change it and so on. So in fact, giving them something which is a straw man and rough and ready almost lends itself to people thinking that this isn't the finished product that can't be touched and can't be changed, and they're more involved. There's also quite a lot of thinking that they will then own the outcome much greater, greater extent. So the risk of partly having all the data scientists go and do stuff and then deliver an answer is the fact that they haven't taken the user on the journey of discovery. So you can either recreate that journey of discovery, which I think a lot of the visualization guys do very well, but they've got to spend a lot of time, plotting that journey, or you have to actually engineer it in such a way that users are much more engaged in that process. But that means perhaps jointly doing things or trying to make them more data. I think there's definitely calls for making them more data savvy so that they're scared of these things. At the same time as you need to make the data scientists a little bit more aware of the domain areas that they're dealing with. And the areas that do a lot of this well, it's because those things do overlap. So they've got the research tradition of working with data, and you look at engineering research where it might be, it's done by engineers typically, not by data scientists. If you were to go and speak to the physics project, they've got a lot of people doing data, but it's driven by the physicists. And they're just necessarily becoming more data savvy. So I think, if you can kind of see it in those terms, it's about who has to do the learning, because whoever does the learning will make changes to their practice. Otherwise you've got this plan change kind of approach, which I think is very difficult to achieve.
Well, I think it's a very astute comment you made about having a rough and ready interface for someone to play with and alter. I collaborate with a Danish company that won numerous awards on website development, And their preferred route is actually, sounds funny, but drawing a wireframing, or actually making the wireframing with scissors and coloured card. And they've actually won more awards than any other software company. They've developed all the a lot of the banking applications.
It lends itself a lot to some of the innovation-related thinking, which is much more about competitions, communication. And that, I think spreading your bets, I think, is a very good strategy. And it's not spending a lot of money, but just spreading your bets and getting lots of ideas coming out and testing them. Because, as many teams as you have, there's so many different ideas. And then perhaps looking at getting them to vote on which ones are the best. So it becomes much less of a top-down planned intervention and much more of a let's vote for let's vote for it. And I think this is where the community of practice idea of, is this a practice evolution kind of model that you're trying to facilitate? In other words, are you trying to make engineers smarter engineers? And they own the engineering practice. It's not for IT to tell engineers how to be better engineers. So there's some very interesting ownership sort of aspects and identity aspects in the middle of some of these sort of questions.
My experience has been, depends very much on your audience. If you've got people who are constantly have the time to think about how to do things better, then they can take something rough and they'll give you pointers to where they want it improved. If they're not, if they're people who just got operational jobs, they're not encouraged or rewarded to thinking it's just like do it fast, then give them 3 choices, they'll pick one.
And not only that, give them something that they can use. And if they find it useful, they will use it. And I think it would be very interesting from a data management perspective to start looking at metrics of usage. Because we tend to launch loads of IT systems into an organisation, and we don't measure which data elements are used. That's just not part of our metrics at the moment. And yet, if you frame information systems as providing data to people, knowing which data elements they're finding and which ones they're using, and which ones they're rating, which ones they don't rate, it sounds like a much more interesting sort of way to do it.
I think you could probably build on that and actually looking at which users across the organisation, which users in practice are using what. Because I've certainly had a situation in the past where certain user groups have completely opted out of the corporate systems. And if you're not looking at the usage of the system or the data and where it's used, then you're potentially missing that. And where are they finding their data from to do the their job?
Because of these spreadsheets and it's not your system and so on. So people are using data, it's just not necessarily corporate data. And lots of additional emphasis. So I think a lot of the emphasis from a data governance perspective has been on data quality and things like that. I think if they emphasise the use more and measuring use, if something's used, the data quality will improve because it has to improve in order from use to action. So I think the quality kind of almost has to go as a follow behind to help, but it has to start with use.
I'm quite interested by the last 2 comments this gentleman you raised, because one of my areas of interest particularly is I work in postgraduate students in research. I work in research companies and also companies, software companies. And interestingly, different groups have different approach to project management. Some groups like to develop their own system, if you like, particularly research students. Junior project managers who just joined a major corporate like to know about what should I do next and can you give me a template. More mature groups in leading software companies, particularly in places like Old Street or California, like to develop their own unique processes. So I think it's even more complicated, the project management route. Again, it comes back to your point about people love to own their own process.
Okay, I think we're just going over very slightly, so I suggest we have a break of wine. We thank Martin.